Behind closed doors, the Intelligence Community Inspector General is set to brief the House Intelligence Committee on a disturbing whistleblower complaint, one that is raising more questions about how President Trump communicates with foreign governments and perhaps what promises he makes to those governments. The Inspector General, who we should note was appointed by this president, called the complaint an urgent concern. And by law, urgency means it's not a policy disagreement. It's an issue of national security concern.
CNN has learned that it came from a U.S. intelligence official who was so troubled by something the president said to a foreign leader on a phone call. This is all according to the Washington Post. The complaint was triggered by a promise that the president made to that foreign leader. The big question this morning, of course, is what exactly was that promise and to whom was the promise made?
One thing is clear, though. A Trump-appointed inspector general evaluated this complaint, found it to be of urgent concern, which means by law it must then be reported to Congress. That's what the law says should happen after that judgment call is made. And yet so far, Congress has not been provided with any information. In effect, the Director of National Intelligence ignoring what is the legal requirement here.
CNN has a team across Washington covering the story from Capitol Hill to the White House. So let's begin this hour with our national security correspondent, Alex Marquardt. Alex, we know which leaders the president spoke to in the weeks, preceding this. But what else can you tell us this morning?
Yeah, Poppy, the timeline here is very important in terms of figuring out which foreign leader the president was speaking to and to whom this promise was allegedly made. That's according to the Washington Post. This complaint, we know, was filed on August 12th. So if we look at the communications that the president had with world leaders in the month prior, there are quite a few of them. Among them, a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Letters were exchanged with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, the Dutch Prime Minister, the Emir of Qatar. We also know that there were phone calls with the Prime Minister of Israel and the new president of Ukraine. So there are a number of possibilities here. Jim and Poppy, as you know well, we get so-called readouts from these communications from the White House. The White House can, of course, say really what they want. In the case of the call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, the White House said that the two world leaders discussed forest fires in Siberia. But what we do know is that there was something that was so disturbing in the communications between the president and a foreign leader that this member of the Intelligence Committee, who the Washington Post said was detailed to the National Security Council, that person felt the need to file a whistleblower complaint. That complaint was of such urgent concern in the mind of the Inspector General of the intelligence community that person then took it directly to the congressional oversight committees. Now, the Director of National Intelligence then responded to a subpoena by the House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, saying, in fact, this is not of urgent concern because it does not directly involve intelligence activity. It involves someone from the executive branch. But now it seems that the acting DNI, Joseph Maguire, is trying to find some middle ground with the House Intelligence Committee, with Capitol Hill. And so we are seeing, as you mentioned, as we speak, the Inspector General testifying behind closed doors to the House Intel Committee. And then next week, the acting DNI himself is expected to testify in open committee to that very same committee. You can be sure, Jim, that this morning those House Intel members are drilling down with that Inspector General, trying to get some answers about who this foreign leader was and what this promise made was, Jim.
And why it raised such alarm. Alex Marquardt, thanks very much. Let's go now to CNN's Manu Raju. He's on Capitol Hill. So, Manu, the Inspector General speaking to lawmakers now. Do we know, particularly as Alex notes, that the DNI is in effect looking for some sort of middle ground here, do we know that the IG is going to now detail this whistleblower complaint or try to give something, but not everything on this?
We don't know that, Jim. In fact, we're waiting for him right now to arrive. He's expected to come around this corner, but in this secure facility right below us, there are several entrances in and out. So people who come to testify behind closed doors, members themselves, can oftentimes slip in and out out of the eyes of the media. But we were told that he may arrive any moment. But if he hasn't arrived yet, he is certainly late. So it's possible he could have already arrived informative, but the question for a lot of the Democrats and Republicans is exactly how much information that he could provide this committee. Will he get into details about that complaint? Will he simply describe the handling of the complaint, as Adam Schiff suggested in his statement last night? That's still unknown. And last night, I can tell you, talking to Democrats and Republicans on this committee, they were still uncertain about what this complaint is, who in the executive branch may have tried to tamp down, prevent this from coming to Capitol Hill. So there are a lot of questions. So the ultimate question is how many of those questions will be answered behind closed doors later today, guys.
Okay, Manu, thank you very much. Let's go to the White House. Our senior Washington correspondent, Joe Johns, joins us there this morning. As of last night, no response from the White House to the Washington Post on this. What about this morning?
That's right. We've reached out to the White House press office and others, Poppy, here at the White House who might be able to shed some light on this, including the National Security Council. So far, we've gotten radio silence. Also watching the president's Twitter feed very closely. Typically by 9 a.m. Eastern time, which is right about now, you'd expect to see several tweets from the president. Nothing so far. Of course, as you know, the president's last tweet was about 11 hours ago out on the West Coast, talking about his border barrier project. And nothing since then. The president got back here a little bit after midnight, so it was a fairly late night for him and the people with him. Also, I think important to say, this is not the only thing the White House is dealing with. They're certainly dealing right now with the issue of Iran and what to do about those strikes on the oil fields. Back to you, Jim and Poppy.
Joe Johns, thanks very much. Joining us now to discuss this, to understand this, CNN legal and national security analyst Asha Rangappa. She's a former FBI special agent, and CNN national security analyst Julia Kayyem, former Homeland Security official. Thanks to both of you. Asha, I want to begin with you because you had a really informative Twitter thread yesterday, which helped explain a lot to me about the background here. First of all, you note this was a Trump appointee. Second of all, by definition, under the law here, it has to be urgent, which means it's not a policy disagreement. It has to be something relates to national security or another issue, and therefore outside the president's constitutional powers to make foreign policy at his will, in effect. So knowing that that's the law, explain what that tells us about the seriousness of this complaint.
Yes, when the complaint concerns the president's interactions with another head of state or foreign leader, the bar for it to pass to be an urgent concern under the definition that's laid out in the statute is very high. And this is because the president has incredibly wide latitude in conducting foreign affairs and in negotiating with world leaders. So, as you said, Jim, this can't simply be, bad policy or unwise policy or some kind of objection in that way. It would have to actually be something that was an abuse of power or violates the law in order for the IG to determine that it met the criteria and should be forwarded to Congress.
Right.
The Washington Post, Juliet, notes this near the end of the piece, quote, statements and letters exchanged between the Office of the DNI and the House Intelligence Committee in recent days have pointed at the White House without directly implicating the president. What questions does that raise for you?
I think that the ODNI is in a bit of a bind right now, and we're going to see how he sort of works his way around that in terms of what his obligation is to Congress and picking up on what possibly could entail some sort of grave concern involving the president. You really can only think of three that would rise to the level of the kind of sort of crisis, maybe a bit strong, that we're at right now. The first, of course, is that President Trump did something for his own personal gain. The second is that he was willing to cede control or direction of an intelligence operation to another country. Mm-hmm. And then the third, of course, is some disclosure of sources and methods of a covert action. Almost nothing else is going to rise to the level of grave concern because, as Asha's pointed out so brilliantly in her Twitter messages last night, policy decisions and policy preferences really are not something that a whistleblower would pay attention to, let alone have an IG refer it immediately for congressional action.
So, Asha, the IG makes that determination. The law is clear here, is it not, that the DNI has to report it to Congress. So why is there an attempt at middle ground here? I mean, is the law not clear that he has to make that report?
The law in its face is very clear. The IG has the discretion and authority to determine whether the complaint meets this high standard. And the point here is to basically vet the complaint so that there's not some kookpot who just, starts whistleblowing. It has to go through him. And then there's basically a heads up to the DNI that this is going to go to Congress. The DNI can add his own commentary. Let's say he disagrees, but there's nothing in the statute that gives the DNI any kind of veto power from it going to Congress. But I suspect what they're trying to hang their hat on here is a constitutional Article 2 kind of argument that this would violate separation of powers.
Well, which is, it's basically the argument comes up with every request from Congress now, every subpoena, a very expansive definition of the president's powers, even when you have an urgent concern here.
Juliet, what do you make of? Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to pick up on what Jim said. Sorry. I think that's right. I think the challenge here is that we have systems in place put into the intelligence community for oversight. And one of those includes a whistleblower statute, which those of us who know some of the egregious behavior of the intelligence community, that's a good thing. These systems are not designed for dealing with a president. It's just simply clear. And so when everyone says, well, there's processes and, the president should do this and there should be disclosure this way, the system is not working. I have to be clear about this because when you have a political overlay that can stop a process designed for anyone but the president, you really are in a bind. And I think that's why we're seeing these really extraordinary leaks. The system was not designed for this.
Okay, ladies, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Asha Rangappa, Juliet Kayyem. Still to come, will this whistleblower investigation just add fuel to the impeachment fire burning or being debated, I should say, on Capitol Hill? We'll talk to a member of the House Judiciary Committee about that and a lot more next. Also, Iran's top diplomat this morning with strong words for the United States and Saudi Arabia, saying there could be, quote, all-out war if a military strike is launched against Iran.
And this.
All right, welcome back. Right now, the Intelligence Community Inspector General is behind closed doors as we speak. He's briefing the House Intel Committee on the recent whistleblower complaint regarding the president's communications with a foreign leader. The Washington Post this morning reports that the whistleblower's concerns involve a promise that the president allegedly made to that foreign leader. We don't know whom. That's a critical question. There are many outstanding questions on this front this morning. Let's talk about this and a lot more with Florida Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Murkesi Paul, a member of the House Judiciary Committee. Good morning. Thank you for being with me.
Good morning.
What is your reaction to the Washington Post reporting that someone in the intel community heard the president make a, quote, promise, according to the Washington Post, to a foreign leader that was so troubling they took it to the Inspector General, and now there's a fight over whether members of Congress can actually see that, even though it's the law that they see it within 7 days?
I am extremely concerned to wake up to these news. We need to understand exactly what promise he made and who he was exactly talking to. What we have learned is that this president continues to put his interests before the country's. This is a matter of national security. I don't sit on the House Intelligence Committee, but I look forward to getting more details on that. We've seen that this president admires and has close relationships to dictators all over the world, including Putin. And if you remember, Poppy, he compromised one of our American sources of intelligence in Russia because he was providing highly classified information. So this has to stop, and it's very worrisome.
You're talking about the meeting in the Oval Office with Kislyak, and I understand that. I do want to note here, we just don't know at this point in time if this does involve classified information. So let's wait until we know more before making that bridge. But I hear your concern. Let me get your take on this. Our Stephen Collinson, who has some interesting analysis on it this morning, talking about the DNI. Joseph McGuire says, quote, McGuire's conduct appears to be the latest manifestation of the administration's multi-front strategy to thwart Congress's oversight efforts. I watched your 7+ minutes of questioning of Corey Lewandowski earlier this week, to little avail, right? You didn't get many direct answers. There was a lot of mocking in that hearing. How confident are you right now, Congresswoman, in Congress's ability to exercise oversight over this administration, giving this just as the latest example?
Yeah, Poppy, I have to tell you the truth. We have never seen an administration that has obstructed Congress's ability to investigate to this level. And we knew that we were going to deal with a very difficult witness, but it was very important for us to bring him forth in front of the Judiciary Committee. But what you saw on Tuesday, regardless of the show that he created, is once again a president that is engaged in cover-up. He has surrounded himself with people that will be loyal to him and continue to cover his steps up. Lewandowski had been asked to ask Sessions to obstruct the investigation that Special Counsel Mueller was conducting. And just so that everybody understands, obstructing our ability to investigate in Congress is an impeachable offense.
So let's talk about where this goes from here, because there are concerns, as you know, from members of your caucus on this front. Let me just read you some interesting quotes from some of them. Representative Jared Huffman of California, quote, "If you're looking to draw out information and begin shaping a narrative for the American people, that," meaning the Lewandowski hearing, "wasn't the witness to do it with." Also, Representative Dan Kildee of Michigan, quote, "There is a numbness that is coming month by month." Does the lack of cohesion in your party on this front hurt your chances?
I think that it's a very difficult and divisive issue, right? Investigating this president. But I understand why they're saying that. Those are the thoughts that sometimes cross my mind. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm very honest about that. But I do think that as a caucus, we're very united in the fact that we have to hold the administration accountable, which is why we have all these different investigations across all the different committees. But at some point, Poppy, we need to decide together as a caucus what are the consequences for this president to continue to obstruct our investigative efforts. I agree with you, and I feel very strongly about that.
I think you said it well. We need to decide as a caucus, but it seems like, Congresswoman, day by day that divide is growing a bit wider. Case in point, let's talk about how to handle the Lewandowski testimony. You had Nancy Pelosi, a representative for her, telling our Jim Acosta she believed that Lewandowski could have been held in contempt right then and there. And Nadler warned him of that, but didn't follow through. John Dean, former White House counsel to President Nixon this morning, let me read you his tweet if we can pull it up on the screen. Speaker Pelosi has green-lighted holding Lewandowski in contempt. They should do it before the weekends. Make a statement, Democrats. The rules apply to Republicans, and their games are over. Is he right? Should Corey Lewandowski be held in contempt this week?
Absolutely. Here's my personal statement. I am not going to speak on behalf of my 200 and plus colleagues. Lewandowski should be held in contempt. There has to be a clear consequence. We can't continue to have an administration mock our investigative powers of Congress.
Let me end on guns, because, this is something that is important to keep at the fore, despite all of the other news that is going on. Attorney General Barr was on the Hill talking to lawmakers about potential gun proposals coming out of the administration. At this point, this is personal for you. You lost your father to gun violence. I'm so sorry for your loss. I know what you have proposed. I wonder what you make of the chances of expanded background checks getting through Congress at this point in time, because after the meeting with Barr, Democratic Senator Joe Manchin said it is up to the president now. Do you think that this president will get something to Mitch McConnell that will make it through Congress that is very similar to what we saw in 2013 when you had a Democratic-controlled chamber and didn't make it through?
Poppy, I think that the American people are speaking very loudly. You know that more than 90% of Americans support a universal background check bill. You're absolutely right. This is very personal to me, to many of my colleagues like Lucy McBath. It's also personal to so many parents in my community who have lost their children to senseless acts of gun violence. There are so many things that we can do, that we can take action. We've done it here in the House of Representatives. We sent several bills, bipartisan bills, to the Senate. They're sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. I think that the pressure is on. We are talking about this issue on a weekly basis. We're going to continue to meet. The Gun Violence Task Force is having different hearings every single week. So I feel optimistic. I'm not giving up on this issue, and it's something that's a priority for me and for the majority of the caucus here in the House of Representatives.
We'll see where this goes, if it does go anywhere. Congresswoman Debbie Murkazil-Powell, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Some tough questions there for her to answer on the impeachment question.
Yeah.
John Bolton is speaking out for the first time since he was fired by President Trump, and the former national security advisor is definitely not praising the president's policies. Plus, we are moments away from the opening bell on Wall Street. Stocks should open slightly, well, possibly slightly higher this morning. Look at those green arrows as the Federal Reserve says it will cut interest rates by another quarter point. It is the second cut in 2 months. Investors, however, were expecting a bigger cut. The Fed chair did leave the door open to another cut in the future. Investors will also be watching news out of Washington, of course, as Chinese negotiators. This morning, Iran's foreign minister is threatening an all-out war if the U.S. or Saudi Arabia strikes Iran. Speaking exclusively with our own Nick Payton-Walsh, here's what he had to say.
What would be the consequence of an American or a Saudi military strike on Iran now?
An all-out war.
You make a very serious statement there, sir.
Well, I make a very serious statement about defending our country.
Zarif also said he is willing to...
So far, would, frankly, they've called it an act of war. They've said that you have fired missiles from your sovereign territory and the sovereign territory of another state.
That's a lie.
Understood. They've accused you of that none the same. These would normally, one might expect, result in some kind of military retaliation. Do you believe Donald Trump is gun-shy?
No. I believe that he has been the subject of an attempt many times to drag the United States into a war, and he has refused. And in spite of the fact that I disagree with many of its policies, I think this is a prudent decision. But it doesn't mean that somebody is gun-shy in order to avoid starting a war based on a lie.
It's a remarkable interview. You should watch the entire thing. Zarif also said he is willing to talk to Saudi Arabia, but the possibility of a return to negotiations with the U.S. is very much uncertain. Let's go to our national security reporter, Kylie Atwood. She joins us this morning. So Pompeo making this trip, also speaking this morning. What are we hearing from the Secretary of State?
Well, I think it's important to note that just this morning, President Trump said that we may have a very strong hit against Iran, saying he would like a peaceful solution. He's not sure if that is possible. But as you said, Poppy, the Secretary of State just coming out of meetings that he's had in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates over the past few days, acknowledging that he had seen these remarks from the foreign minister of Iran, but saying that the U.S. is looking for a peaceful solution here, talking about building a coalition. Let's listen to what he had to say.
That's what President Trump, it's what America always wants. We'd like a peaceful resolution indeed. I think we've demonstrated that. They've taken down an American UAVs, conducted the largest attack on the globe's energy in an awfully long time. And we are still striving to build out a coalition. I was here in an active diplomacy while the foreign minister of Iran is threatening all-out war and to fight to the last American. We're here to build out a coalition aimed at achieving peace and a peaceful resolution of this. That's my mission set.
Now, Secretary Pompeo also has commented on the importance of using the United Nations General Assembly next week. That's in New York City with world leaders from across the globe coming. And he said that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are going to be talking at that meeting about the way forward here, not explicitly saying that the U.S. is looking at a military option. It's important to note that Pompeo did say yesterday that this was an act of war, but he said it was an act of war against Saudi Arabia. It was on Saudi territory. It was not an act of war against the U.S. So where the U.S. goes from here is a bit unclear. We know there's a National Security Council meeting today to discuss the way forth with Iran, and then Secretary Pompeo will be returning to Washington later tonight to really map the way forward. But there is still a very active, ongoing decision-making process. Poppy?
Okay, Kylie Atwood, thank you for that important update. We appreciate it. Meantime, the former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, seems to be slamming the president, the man who fired him. This happened during a closed-door event here in New York.
Yeah, it didn't take long. According to someone who attended the event last night, Bolton had, quote, nothing positive to say about his old boss, and, in fact, criticized the president's current approach to Iran, but also to North Korea and Afghanistan. CNN White House correspondent Abby Phillips, she's following these developments. So how far did John Bolton go here?
Well, Jim, it's hard to believe that someone like John Bolton wouldn't know that these comments would eventually come out. And all of this happened in this closed-door meeting without Bolton even saying Trump's name explicitly. But implicitly, he criticized the foreign policy strategy led by President Trump, specifically the president's desire to continue to negotiate with countries like Iran and like North Korea, and also with the Taliban. Now, this issue of the president's desire to bring the Taliban here to the United States for a summit at Camp David is one of the main reasons that precipitated the break in this relationship with the president and his national security advisor. We've reported that the president and Bolton got into a heated argument over this issue in the Oval Office just before Bolton resigned. And yesterday at this closed-door meeting, John Bolton said that he thought it was disrespectful that the president would consider bringing the Taliban to the United States just days before the anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks. Bolton also went on to criticize the president's reaction to Iran, saying that Iran was to blame for some of these drone attacks in the Middle East, and that if the United States continued to not respond to them, it would only embolden that regime. So this back and forth between the president and his former national security advisor seems to be ongoing. President Trump himself has had only really negative things to say about John Bolton, criticizing his approach to all of these issues as well. But Bolton has made it clear he is not going quietly into the night after leaving this White House, unlike some of these other officials who have left without really publicly criticizing the president.
Bolton book coming, Abby? Who knows?
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Right, exactly.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so the Washington Post reporting this morning that the president made a promise to an unnamed foreign leader and sparked a whistleblower complaint. Much more on that ahead. President Trump is at the center of a heated dispute this morning between the Director of National Intelligence and Congress. The Washington Post says this all stems from a promise that the president allegedly made to a foreign leader.
Now, according to the Post, this promise was seen as so troubling that it prompted a U.S. intelligence official to file a whistleblower complaint. Let's discuss all of this and more with Wes Lowery, CNN contributor and national reporter for the Washington Post, and Ayesha Rascoe, she's White House reporter for NPR. Let me ask you, Ayesha, here, because what is key about this is the complaint, but also the administration's response to this complaint so far. You got a sitting director of national intelligence moving slowly at best to abide by the law here, which requires reporting such a complaint to Congress. And that fits into a broader pattern of this administration ignoring law and practice when it comes to oversight by the House. What's the Dems' response here? Can they force the DNI to detail what this complaint actually was?
Well, it seems like that's what they're trying to move ahead with. They're going to have a hearing where they're going to try to press this the acting DNI to at least explain his actions. And then after that, you would have to see whether they would push the administration further. Often these things, if they can't get decided, they can end up in court. And there is an argument that this is what the law requires and that the DNI really doesn't have the authority to not turn this over. But as you said, this is part of a larger thing for this administration. They have kind of basically bargained that they can just push everything down the road and that they don't have to comply with oversight. But this in particular is supposed to be dealing with national security. And was appointed by the Trump administration saying that this is an urgent concern. So I think this is going to be harder to push away.
For sure, and that's a key point, Ayesha. I'm glad you bring it up. Wesley Lowery, just what does it tell you that someone also thought it was so important for the public to know that this was apparently about a promise made by the president to a foreign leader that they told the Washington Post? They told your paper.
Of course. I mean, remarkable reporting by some of my colleagues here, but it does. I mean, the idea that leaks like this coming from intelligence, it does speak to, and I think it was represented even in the piece that was written, how significant that is, right? That there's a concern. It reminds me actually of a lot of the reporting that came out very early in the Trump administration, where the president, and at the time even President-elect, would have calls with foreign leaders and transcripts of the calls would leak, something that at the time was relatively unheard of. That type of reporting reporting has largely ceased. There's still been tons of different leaking out of the White House and other reports about the president and his behaviors in his conversation. But there was a particular strand of reporting like this that, if we remember, back in 2017 was happening all the time about how the president was engaging foreign leaders. Reading the piece reminded me a lot of that. And it's very interesting to me, reading this reporting and looking at it, that someone thought whatever it is they heard or whatever they were aware of reached to the level that they needed to publicly disclose this and create public pressure now, because again, this is something that could have played out privately, could have continued to be a fight between Dems on the Hill and the intelligence community and the Trump administration, but now it's the public pressure. We're talking about it on television, which starts to change the dynamics of the story itself.
The question is, does it change the reaction, right? Because as you know, Wes, this is part of a pattern here. The president shared classified information with Russians in an Oval Office meeting May 2017. I reported last week in July 2017, there was concern in the IC that he discussed classified intelligence with Putin. In Hamburg, you now have someone taking a step here, Aisha, to use this relatively rarely used process, a whistleblower process, citing another concern here, not necessarily relating to intelligence, but still communications with a foreign leader. Why no bipartisan reaction to this?
I think that part of the reason is, as Wes was saying, that there have been these leaks and things about basically the way President Trump has handled his talks with foreign leaders, and in the past he's been able to get at least past them, to kind of get through those scandals. And so you see Republicans are probably reticent to come out until they know exactly what is being said, because they know if they do, they risk the president attacking them. And look, this isn't an issue dealing with the security of the U.S., so you would think that would be a bipartisan issue. But in this town, often it's looking at the political calculations of it. They may want to know what it's all about before they actually stick their neck out.
If they stick their neck out.
If they do. If they do.
Yeah.
Wesley, I'd love to turn the page here and ask you about 2020 and the Democratic field. There's some interesting, we saw the boost that Elizabeth Warren got in the recent NBC Wall Street Journal poll out earlier this week, really closely trailing Biden. The Fox poll this morning shows her further down. She's at 16%, Sanders is at 18%. So it's important to look at all of it in context. But The Atlantic has a really interesting piece out this week. The title is Why Ex-Sanders Supporters Are Backing Warren. And they point to specifically the Working Families Party, which is this grassroots progressive organization that was backing Sanders in 2016 and is now backing Elizabeth Warren. Is that a one-off, or is that a trend here? As, Sanders loses his guy in charge of operations in Iowa? What do you think?
Look, I think it's one of the most fascinating subplots of the Democratic race, right, is the grapple and the tug of war between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Two senators who've been friends for a long time, who agree on much more than they disagree on, although are very different tactically, stylistically, and do have some substantive disagreements, right? But this push and pull between folks who, in a two-person race, might want to have supported Senator Sanders over Hillary Clinton, who now, when presented with additional options, might give someone like Elizabeth Warren a glance. So it's fascinating to see the Working Families Party with this endorsement relatively early in the race to Elizabeth Warren. But they're getting some pushback. I was talking to some activists yesterday who were saying that the Sanders folks have come back at the Working Families Party. And so it's still a very divisive issue as these two really grapple for if Joe Biden were to start losing support, if he becomes less inevitable, less of a front runner, who ascends? And Sanders and Warren currently are the two people who the polls show are kind of in the position to do that. And so because of that, their supporters are engaged in a real tug of war over this narrative of who is the next person and who is the leading progressive candidate.
It's really interesting to watch. Thank you both so much, Aisha Roscoe, Wes Lowery. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ahead, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau under fire this morning after a photo of him surfaced wearing brown face. This is in 2001. He's apologized, but is it enough, especially during a tough